right, everybody. Good morning and welcome to today's Medical Alley webinar titled Partnership in Medical Device Manufacturing from Concept to Market. My name is Ben Wagner. So great to be with you all here today from wherever you're logging on. I'm the Associate Director of Communications here at Medical Alley and proud to be your host for today's conversation. Before we get started, I do want to say thank you to Protolabs for their partnership and their support. You'll hear more about their work in just a moment, but I do want to take a moment to recognize the ongoing collaboration and work here with our team at Medical Alley. Great to work with their team and excited to kind of advance their leadership and innovation and manufacturing excellence across our community. So thank you to the team who's with us here today. Let's dive in. Today we are exploring really what it takes to bring a medical device from concept to market and exploring how partnerships, collaboration, and digital manufacturing really are reshaping that journey. And to help us dive into that topic, I am thrilled to welcome Dan Snetselaar, the product leader for CNC machining at Protolabs. Dan's been with the company for more than 9 years, joining the company really at a pivotal time when additive manufacturing was being introduced and CNC machining was rapidly expanding. He began his career at Protolabs as a technical skills training leader, a role that helped him really become a true subject matter expert in CNC machining. And today he leads product strategy for one of Protolabs' core manufacturing capabilities. So Dan, with that introduction, great to have you with us here today. I will turn it over to you to get us started.
Awesome. Thank you, Ben. Thank you to the whole team at Medical Alley. We love any chance we get to work with you all because of the really awesome grouping of people that come together anytime we get to do events like these. So thank you to the whole team there. And thank you to everyone. I'd echo Ben's comments. Thank you to everyone who's joining us online. So as we're going through things today, we have an agenda that we'll put out in front of you right now. What I will say is we really love to have questions and some engagement from you all. So as you're hearing us chat a little bit, I might not be able to stop and answer questions in the middle of it, but as Ben said, at the end, we will have questions. So please be thinking about what kind of you're most interested in, even if it's just some commentary at the end. We'd love to hear all of that. But at kind of a high level, we've got about 5 sort of broad topics that we want to address today, and they all kind of cascade from each other. We'll start with really how medical and manufacturing as industries have sort of grown together and driven each other. We'll talk about what digital manufacturing is, which is sort of the newer element of manufacturing and really what Protolabs represents, or one of the core pieces that Protolabs represents. We'll also talk about collaborative design processes, accelerating innovation, and optimizing for efficiency, all pieces that come from these conversations and these relationships that are going on between medical engineers, designers, new product specialists, and manufacturing partners, particularly, or I should say increasingly more in the digital space. With that, let's jump into exactly where medical has had an impact on manufacturing. And it's not to say that there's no med without manufacturing or no manufacturing without med, but as we're talking today, you'll start to see that there are a lot of elements that medical industry and really any of the higher scrutiny, the higher regulated industries bring along with it. So when we look at medical specifically, manufacturing has been around in one form or another for a very long time, right? But as we started to see demanding needs or the needs and the demands of certain industries raise, what we were starting to notice is that there are expectations and requirements in how these parts are made, how these parts are delivered, that are just, they're non-negotiable for certain industries. Medical is one of the main ones you think of, and it's one of the ones that we see a lot in our world, but you can also think of automotive, aerospace, particularly commercial. So those particular industries, while they are innovating, they're always coming up with new solutions. The demand and the requirements they have are also always increasing. So what you see is that drive for innovation, that drive for new solutions, meaning that manufacturing had to come along and develop new solutions to support those part needs. It's one thing to design a perfect part, right? It's another thing to be able to get that part made. So having these two industries kind of grow together and seeing the impact that has on other industries, particularly some of the more innovative work we see coming out of Aero today, it really shows you how that phrase, a rising tide raises all ships, right? That's the same idea we think of when we look at the impact of an industry like medical on manufacturing in general. And then as we have more of the conversation today, you'll see where digital manufacturing steps in and closes even more of those gaps. Now, obviously, you heard me mention industries, particularly med, right? But you think of commercial aviation, so aerospace in that way, and then also automotive. The quality requirements also were a substantial part of manufacturing improvements. So having requirements like clean rooms, for example, that's one that we always think of going hand in hand with med. And we know that that's something that for certain parts, for certain projects, it's the base expectation. There's no negotiating that. And having those kinds of requirements and expectations for medical device manufacturers or those folks involved in manufacturing medical devices, it has meant that process optimizations carry over. We're better at manufacturing in cleaner, more efficient ways because we know that's the quality expectation for our biggest medical customers and other folks in similar industries. Now, one piece that I don't think is solely unique to med, but we see it so much in med and we see it driving so much value in the digital manufacturing space for med is that need for mass customization. We know that historically production and really getting to market is how can I scale up a product and get to tens of thousands, maybe millions of these products every single year, and doing so as repetitively and as efficiently as possible. Now, what you see in med, not surprisingly, given the nature of a lot of the work that different medical device companies or really just medical companies in general are doing, but it's that need to have a closer to one-to-one solution for an individual patient. The prosthetics example that we'll see in a moment here is a really great example because obviously not every generalized structure or form for a prosthetic is going to work for everybody. So you have that need to customize at least in certain ways so that there's more, maybe it's ergonomic, right? Maybe it's functionality, whatever the case might be. Med is really one of those industries that sees the need for mass customization really blooming. And that's where digital manufacturing and really more lean and agile manufacturing options in general can step in and help fill some of those newer needs that the historical manufacturing industry hasn't quite gotten up to speed with yet, or at least the traditional version of that manufacturing industry. Now, as you can see, right, these pieces all come together to show that while it isn't solely medical, right, it's a number of industries and the need to serve those industries, but it shows you that as these industries, and med is one of the fastest evolving of all of them, as that evolution is occurring, manufacturing needs to evolve right along with it. And we think that we're taking a lot of those steps, but obviously it's a continuous evolution process. And we know that there's going to be even more innovation in the future. And we fully expect that innovation that medical industry companies are doing to pass right along to what we're seeing on the manufacturing side as well. Now, I've said digital manufacturing a few times, and it's something that just in terms of the definition of words, I'm sure makes a lot of sense, right? But it is also something that we know it's a little bit ambiguous too. So when we look at digital manufacturing at the very base level, it's an online presence, an online portal, an online interface where you can get information, you can send your files through, you can get quotes. So when we're looking at particularly new, innovative, whether it's a startup or a really established medical company, we see that need to get parts made, and it's anywhere from small prototypes all the way to parts that they plan to make tens of thousands of, but there's a need to get that information quickly. That's the whole goal for digital manufacturing, is that by creating an online community or space where those quotes can happen and that information exchange can occur, we're getting that feedback to customers, to engineers, to designers as quickly as possible and helping them move along their processes as well. There's also something to be said for general accessibility for, a startup type option. For example, you're going to hear me talk about a gentleman named Monster Mike Schultz as an example in just a moment here. But accessibility is really one of those key things where he started as an innovator, as an entrepreneur. He had an idea and he wasn't really sure where to go with it. But in getting his files together and spending just a few minutes on protolabs.com, he was able to start engaging with our system, get design feedback, get quoting feedback, and it really fueled the business he was driving. And we'll talk more about that in just a moment here. But that kind of accessibility is just as valuable for somebody like that who's maybe working out of their garage to start out with, as it is valuable for engineers that are at a company that has thousands of employees, right? We know that resources can be constrained, and having that accessibility is really key. Now that leads, as I just mentioned, straight into the expanded capacity and resources that a digital manufacturing option can bring to companies in the medical industry. The idea there is that you have designers, you have engineers, you have scientists that are experts in the biomed engineering of that device. Maybe, that device or that product does the function it needs to do exactly right. It feels great, it looks great, but when it comes time to manufacture it, all of a sudden you have all these different issues or all these trade-offs you're starting to look at. So in having additional resources that understand manufacturing or really understand building a part from the ground up, you're not just leveraging your own internal expertise that you already have, but you're able to leverage that additional expertise as well. Obviously, from a capacity standpoint, even with established supply chains or in-house operations that companies might have, having that expanded capacity, especially in a very quick turn in a very agile environment, it means you can do that much more, right? You have that many more options to look at a project and say, where could we trim some time? Where could we maybe find some efficiency and some improvements as this whole timeline is being considered? And then there's reducing risk. It says design risk on the slide. I probably should have just made it risk in general, right? Because there's a lot of different pieces of risk that by having preemptive knowledge, preemptive information, you can hedge or you can manage better. And that's especially critical when you look at an industry like medical, because we know that the cost of fixing an error further down the road can be really, really substantial and really, really impactful in a negative way on that business. But being able to look at design risk, being able to look at supply chain risk, having an option like a digital manufacturer means you have just that another resource, another potential option to consider. And it allows you to look at that kind of broader risk spectrum and say, can we make some improvements, right? Can we potentially improve how we're doing this? Now, just like we would see with the new medical devices that are coming out, just like you would see with some of the most innovative technology that's going into the medical industry today, that evolution is also driving digital manufacturers. So you heard me just a moment ago talk about, from a broader manufacturing perspective, how the evolution of industries like med really helped drive the evolution of an industry like manufacturing. Obviously, that same thing is true for the digital environment as well. Being a digital manufacturer doesn't mean that you can bring less to the table. And you're learning more and more every year that those evolving needs, those evolving expectations for medical companies are being passed right along to us. And we need to evolve and make sure we're addressing those as they're coming up for the actual end users and the folks that we're working with on a daily basis. Now, as we get into what these conversations look like, right? What's happening every single day at companies like Protolabs, between companies like larger medical manufacturers, medical designing houses, these conversations are happening every day. And what the digital environment does, what digital manufacturing does, is it allows a space for that information to be very easily passed. So again, you're talking about these companies that have expertise in their areas and they know everything about their specific product, their specific purpose, backwards and forwards. But maybe they're not thinking about all of the manufacturing implications, right? All of the things that need to be done to make sure that you can produce those parts for your customers, for your patients, for your clients on a regular basis and not have anything potentially go wrong in the back end, right? So when you're talking about bringing that manufacturing expertise in to couple with designing, that's one of the coolest things that we get to see on a daily basis, is taking a solution that is in a concept and it's maybe ideally designed, and then being able to say, okay, here are some efficiencies, here are some improvements, or maybe even required changes that we would suggest for the sake of manufacturing. That kind of collaboration doesn't necessarily, or I should say that kind of knowledge to collaborate with doesn't necessarily exist across the broader spectrum of every company, right? So being able to tap into that can be a really powerful tool and a really powerful resource. Now, it's not just from a design and manufacturing perspective either, right? There are so many new technologies that are coming out every single year, right? If we look at technologies available for something like additive today compared to where it was 10 years ago, the list is going to be tenfold longer, right? The types of technologies, the types of machines, what those machines can do, it varies and it changes and it evolves all the time. So when you're talking about this consultative design feedback, or you're talking about being able to communicate with the manufacturer efficiently and fluidly, what we're really talking about is also getting expertise in new technologies. There may be additive technology that's so new that it'd be ridiculous to expect anybody at an established company to be an expert right now because it's that new. But then being able to lean on someone like Protolabs or another digital manufacturer that has experience with it, it gives you all of that collective knowledge to kind of feed into it. Now, all of that means, all of that feedback is really you're preemptively troubleshooting. You're getting out ahead of potential issues, whether it's something that is really substantial and prohibitive to even moving forward in your design process, or maybe it's just something to make everything a little more efficient, a little more cost effective. These are all the kinds of conversations that having them in a more digital and kind of theoretical environment before you're fully committing to these long runs, these big intensive production runs, you're able to learn a lot before having to make those mistakes. And so you're ready for some of those potential pitfalls that might come. I'm going to call back to Monster Mike, go a little bit more in depth on that example. It's a gentleman whose real name is Mike Schultz. We call him Monster Mike. That's kind of his branding. He was a he was a extreme sports athlete, motocross. He did snowmobiling, snowboarding, basically anything fast and downhill. He was doing it. And he, in a competition, had an accident and unfortunately had to have the bottom half of one of his legs amputated. And so, in having that happen to him, he wanted to continue to do what he loved. He wanted to still be able to snowboard, still be able to ride a snowmobile. And as he was looking at the prosthetic options he had, specifically for those kinds of activities, that just they weren't up to snuff, or at least not in a way that did exactly what he needed to do without having to spend an exorbitant amount of money on it. So in having a digital manufacturing option, Mike, just of his own volition, decided to start designing and planning a prosthetic. And you can see the image on screen, the right side of the screen right now. That's an example of one of his prosthetics. But so he started designing it so that it would have the reactivity and also be able to withstand all of the different strains he wanted to put on it in his extreme sports. So he became a Paralympian, and he also supports a wide variety of other athletes in designing and creating these custom and these uniquely fabricated prosthetics. And that's the kind of thing where, again, would Mike have been able to do it if there wasn't digital manufacturing? Yes, absolutely, right? He knew what he needed to do, but being able to do it a lot quicker and being able to access it, it meant that those barriers to even begin his journey in developing this product, those were much, much lower. So we saw this really big benefit, and it was really kind of a cool story for us to be part of, because it's seeing a really, really awesome end use, but it's also seeing a type of innovation that maybe would have looked much, much differently, gone much, much slower, and been much, much more challenging if Mike would have been, trying to do this maybe 15 years prior, 20 years prior. All right. And so a lot of what Protolabs specifically aims to do, but a lot of where the digital manufacturing space is trying to close gaps is in that expedited communication, right? Whether it's design, whether it's supply chain planning, whatever the case might be, we know, and this is especially true for med, that first tends to win. So obviously, in any industry, being the first on the market or being an early player on the market is going to be a huge benefit. But this seems to be even acutely true for an industry like med. So we really see the value in that time and that total timeline from concept all the way into market. And so one of the big pieces we see, one of the big benefits we see coming out of digital manufacturing in the last several years has been that ability to expedite iteration testing. One of the things about Protolabs specifically that's really, really awesome is we fully welcome iteration testing and design testing, even if it's just for the sake of quoting. We have customers who will send in 10 different versions of a quote just to get some of that initial feedback. How viable is it for manufacturing? What are some of the costs and the timelines? You can nail down a lot of that information extremely quickly, whereas previously, or I should say historically, it would be a situation where you'd have to wait, you'd get the part, you'd beat it up, you'd test it, you'd get some feedback, you'd make some notes, right? You'd be doing all these additional things. And then you'd have to start back at square one with the new design, doing testing, all of that. Having a digital design space means that we can provide a lot of that initial feedback before you're ever even having to go through beating up parts or go through some of these more time-intensive steps in the validation process. So being able to expedite even just that design piece is really, really crucial. But it's not just about the design of the part, right? And about expediting the timeline in terms of how quickly we make the part, but it's about designing for manufacturability. And it's about thinking about that end production purpose, or that end production process, I should say. What we're talking about there is you can have a part that making one or two, it works great. You're able to get exactly what you need, perfectly designed, does exactly what it needs to do. But then maybe you get to the point where you need 10,000 every year. And then all of a sudden, maybe it's cost, maybe it's just the challenge in actually producing those parts. But some of those things can end up being a little bit of a surprise because the functionality, some of those testing purposes weren't necessarily thinking about that end environment. So in having the ability to say, okay, I know this is how I'm going to make the part when I'm getting production made and sending these out annually. and being able to preemptively expect what kind of feedback and what kind of requirements you would need from a design perspective. Even in the part you see on screen right now, you're seeing a lot of ribbing, you're seeing a lot of coring out. That is because we knew that was an injection molded part, and we made the recommendation that by having that kind of coring and that ribbing, you get a lighter weight, stronger part, but it's also going to look nicer because there's not going to be a risk of sinking or any of those kind of cosmetic deformations. So in just getting information like that quickly, you're able to say, all right, if we design it this way, we have confidence that when it does hit that production state in the end, it's going to go through as smoothly and as efficiently as possible. Now, what all of that is to say, right? Anything you're talking about, acceleration, it's getting to market faster. One of the unique pieces or the unique elements of a lot of the medical industry that we work with is that there are these very long validation processes. There are these intensive testing days and weeks. There's a lot of pieces that need to go into place before there's even approval to say you can start to look at the market and start to actually looking at sending this product out to real people and end users. So that validation step, being able to accelerate design phases and even those initial manufacturing phases is really, really crucial from a validation perspective, because all of a sudden you're able to say, we've done the things we need to do just from a legal obligation standpoint, and now we're ready to move into the market. So when you look at how all of those pieces can build sort of a chain of efficiency, that's really the goal of digital manufacturing, and specifically the goal of Protolabs is to say, let's take those early phases that we know historically have been the longest. They've required sitting down or long phone calls or going over designs back and forth for potentially weeks at a time. And let's try to make that a few days of conversation where a lot of the feedback is digitally provided and readily available. So in being able to do that, you're helping those customers say, all right, let's look at the total timeline and let's see where we can bring in an option like a digital manufacturer and maybe cut down significant portions of the timeline we have through validation. Oh, right. Optimizing for efficiency. This is kind of the last piece that we're going to touch on a little bit here. So really, optimizing for efficiency is kind of a culmination of a lot of the things that we've already talked about. So part of this is saying, hey, we want this to be as painless as possible, right? That's true of anybody basically doing anything in life. And a lot of the pieces that have been built around the digital manufacturing process is something like Protolabs user interface. The idea behind that is to make that path as smooth as possible. So when we look at the early testing, when we look at that early information, we want you to be able to get that information quickly, get those parts quickly, learn and improve and move on as quickly as possible. But we also want to be able to say, hey, if you are moving into production, there are times when you might also want to get additional support. One of the things we'll see when we have customers that really do plan to prototype or to do those early stage validation testing activities with Protolabs, and they know they're going to move into production in the end, those customers in some cases will see them come back because maybe there was a line down situation, right? Their main vendor or maybe a production vendor overseas has an issue, their line is down, and all of a sudden they need to act quickly. Otherwise, they have orders waiting, they're not getting product out the door, right? Whatever their clients, customers, their patients are, they aren't getting something that they might really need. So having a backup option that you've already planned manufacturing around, like a digital manufacturer in Protolabs, gives you that ability to have some of that kind of that backup and a little bit of that safety net. Now, another thing that you're going to be able to see in that kind of path to production is the impact of learning things too late. And you heard me kind of touch on this earlier. But one of the things that we've heard kind of some horror stories from in customers that we work with is everything seemed great, in the initial testing, everything went really well. They maybe did some additive prototypes and they even did some production indicative testing and they got validation, or maybe they didn't even need to go through all that. Maybe it's a wearable, right? And then when they're fully ready, they've paid all this money for a big mold overseas and they've got a production house that's building their parts. And then in those first months, they learn, oh, there's actually a serious issue we need to change. Maybe it's even a really small feature. But changing something that small means back to the drawing board for the whole manufacturing process. So all of a sudden you have this whole long journey and you've effectively been told to hit reset on it. So being able to learn those mistakes early or being able to preempt some of those challenges or design problems early means that when you are at that point, while you're never going to be risk-free, right? That's not something that exists in our world today, but you know that you've hedged as much of that risk as possible. And that's where you can see some of those efficiencies that seem small along the way, but can really stack up to something really substantial. We also see digital manufacturing as a way to facilitate more flexible testing with the ability to quickly get parts and different types of parts. The hope is that testing that maybe at some point was deemed bonus, right, or just extra that you didn't necessarily need, but that would have been nice to do for a part. Sometimes if you look at a timeline, there's not room to test all 40 things you want to test, and you can only maybe test 30 or 35 scenarios. So having the ability to more quickly prototype and turn through some of those different designs, it gives that option to say, okay, we can test these things and we're not sacrificing time like we might have thought. And it allows just for that a little bit more exploratory approach when you're talking about developing parts and making sure you're testing every little environment possible. We always will hear about, well, we designed it for X, Y, and Z, and then, it was thrown into salt water and we didn't plan for that. So even little things like that, we know being able to test that or having just a little bit of extra time, it can mean headaches down the road for sure, or saving headaches down the road. And then what I think personally is the biggest piece is developing kind of best practices and a collaborative learning approach. We talked earlier about how there might not be an engineer or an expert at every company for every single type of technology. I used additive as an example then because there's 20 different additive technologies at any given point. And so having the ability to communicate fluidly, right, to where you're getting to where you need to go, you're getting the information back quickly that you need to get, but that you're also sharing this learning. We might have a project with a big medical company like Philips, and they're asking us to do something, and we're going, okay, this is going to be challenging, but we've got a team that did something similar 6 months before, or at least similar enough that we can take some of those learnings. All of a sudden, you're talking about a lot of different minds, a lot of different expertise and knowledge going into what is otherwise, what otherwise might have been a fairly siloed process. So all of a sudden, we're having a lot of this communication, we're having a lot of this learning, and it doesn't take somebody at your company having learned a lesson the hard way. Maybe we learned a lesson the hard way, right? And then all of a sudden, those things can be shared. And before long, you're just stacking up that kind of knowledge. So as we see digital manufacturing becoming a more entrenched part of the medical development process, really of any development process in general, the ability to share those learnings and to have that communication and that same end goal has been really, really substantial. And so as we're wrapping up here and getting ready for questions, I'm going to put just a little bow on it before we fully jump into the questions that we see here. But hopefully we kind of stayed at a high level, but hopefully throughout the conversation we've had for the last 20 some minutes here, you've been able to see that there are requirements and expectations in the med industry, or there are benefits in the med industry that come from being able to leverage things like digital manufacturers. We know that there are companies that are small enough that they might not have the clout to get their parts made as quickly or to get the same level of priority as maybe a bigger company when you look at more traditional manufacturing options. So for smaller companies like that, smaller innovators, for Kickstarters, for those new versioning companies, they now have the ability to tap into substantial engineering and technological resources just by being able to go online, just by being able to get some quotes, get some feedback, and have some conversations. So even those small companies see the benefits. We see so many people at big companies that are in the exact same boat. Resources are constrained, whatever the case might be. So having more options, and particularly an option that's easy to use, quick to communicate with, and quick to provide parts, those pieces that are really represented by digital manufacturing, they've found a really, really nice spot with the med industry. And we see the future being med industry understanding more and more how to use outfits like digital manufacturers or quick turn shops like Protolabs would be, finding more and more ways to leverage those and benefit from some of those practices in their own processes and make them more entrenched parts of their supply chains. We even see today that some folks are fully in production with digital manufacturers like Protolabs for surgical robots. So there's all these different technologies that 20 years ago, if you would have asked me as I guess a teenager, then I was going to say a kid, but a teenager, I would have said, I don't think that could happen in a million years. But today you're seeing the way these processes come together, these different kind of innovative views at looking at manufacturing coming together to really support some awesome end products like we saw earlier with Monster Mike and a lot of the different work we're seeing from a huge number of medical folks in the industry. So as that innovation keeps driving and continuing, we see the digital manufacturing space doing the exact same. And with that, I think we can open it up for questions.
Yeah, Dan, I've got a few questions for you here too, and thank you for that presentation. And to everybody who's attending here too, I sent out a link to if you're interested in learning a little bit more about Monster Mike Schultz, which I was too. So save that link and take a look afterward. You can see a little bit of a video there from Protolabs as well. But Dan, thank you for that overview. I think it was great to hear more about the really benefits of that collaborative learning and that institutional knowledge that Protolabs has. I would invite everybody in attendance, if you have a question, open up that Q&A box at the bottom of your screen and drop questions in there. We've got some time to utilize Dan's expertise here. But in the meantime, I've got a couple of questions here too. And I'll start off with this, Dan, here. What do you think really is the most common driver for medical companies to use digital manufacturing today?
Mm. Yeah, no, that's a good one. But there's a lot of different pieces to it. I think the biggest one is probably just going to be speed, particularly when you look at digital manufacturing. Speed of communication is a big piece, but in most cases, part of leveraging that digital environment, whether it's a network or an outfit kind of like Protolabs, where it's a network and factory sort of hybrid, most digital manufacturing platforms know that speed is an area to target. So I think, or at least an area of need, I should maybe say more than an area to target, but it's an area of pretty substantial need. So that speed element coming into play is probably the biggest one. And obviously, we talked about the timelines in med being so critical to getting to market and being one of those early adopters. And so I think speed is probably the biggest one. But I think we also underestimate, and maybe I guess I'm using a collective we, but I think there's also an underestimation of how much digital manufacturers can be used for even small things like facilitating work. So one of the things we see a fairly substantial amount of is jigs and fixtures. So you're talking about somebody who's maybe in a testing lab and they need to build a custom fixture to test a specific product. And so when they get to that point, they say, okay, I just need a one-off part. I just need it, I need this shape to hold my cone or to hold my beaker, whatever the case might be. And if they go to their internal machine shop, that project is going to be the lowest priority on the list because it's just a fixture. It's not even a true part, right? So there are these other kind of, I guess, I don't want to say ancillary, but almost ancillary type elements of companies that still need parts made and they'd love to get them quickly. But just by nature of maybe the work that those parts are doing, they're not as high a priority. There's not as much urgency on them. So having something like a digital manufacturer where you can throw it in quickly and say, I need this fixture. Okay, it's going to be here in 2 days and it's going to be $200. Perfect. I can get that. And now as an engineer or that testing engineer, I don't have to wait in line. I don't have to hope that there's resources available. I don't have to stop the work I'm doing while I wait for my internal resources or maybe even just other channels, other resources to get me what I need. So that speed piece is always going to be there. But I think there's also that element of just being able to quickly and easily access a quote option to get your part, and you're not having to go back and forth for a long time, and you're not having to wait a long time to actually have that part in hand.
A good question here comes in from Carrie, who says, I'm pretty new to this. Can you tell me the steps? What does an entrepreneur with an idea for a medical device need to have already to use digital manufacturing?
Yeah, no, Carrie, that's a great question. And I love the entrepreneurial questions. There's a lot of factors that go into that from the broadest level, as I'm sure you can imagine if you're even thinking about that. If we're talking manufacturing specifically, really what it's going to come down to is CAD model. And I know that's probably kind of a weird place to hear me comment as to start. But when you have your idea, digital manufacturers like Protolabs, the very start of the conversation is always show us a CAD model, which is a 3D, it's computer aided design. It's just a 3D image or 3D rendering of the parts or parts that you intend to make, right? So whatever components go into that device that you're planning, break those out, have those in digital CAD models. And then if it's Protolabs or really anybody, you can go into most websites and start the quoting process. And what that does is it shows you pricing initially. So you can kind of go, okay, I'm getting an idea of what this might cost if I look at different options. It shows you timing. So if you are looking at a long-term schedule, you start to build some of that out in your head. And it also gives you that design feedback that you kind of heard me talk about earlier. So while there is so much planning from a material analysis, you have to know what material you want to use. You have to maybe understand if there are cleaning practices that also need to come along with the manufacturing, right? So there are a lot of additional pieces that you need to be aware of. But as far as just saying, how can I start to even get a little bit of feedback, get an idea of pricing and timing, which is where you can start to build some of those other elements of that the new idea or the entrepreneurial idea you're spinning up. It really does just start with that CAD model. That's all Protolabs needs to quote. Unfortunately, we can't just quote from a drawing or just like verbally hearing what a part looks like. So we do need that 3D CAD model. But once you have that, a lot of those initial conversations and the design and manufacturing conversations become much, much easier, and they can come much quicker.
Another good question here from Brian, who asks, as a medical IoT device startup, Internet of Things, I believe, as I'm expanding my acronym library here, startup based out of the University of Minnesota, what is a good time to engage Protolabs? Their approach is to engineer as much as possible in-house, but recognize iterations may be needed as we near prototyping and consider manufacturing and QMS.
Yes, that's another question, man. We get awesome questions. I love this. So that's another great one. What I would say is, I think the general outlook or the mentality you have, which is let's get it as refined and as engineered as possible. Nothing wrong with that. What I will say though, and there's I'm sure there's one or two folks at Protolabs who would be like, well, I don't know if you should say that, Dan, but leverage resources, whether it's Protolabs or another digital manufacturer. Obviously, I have my biases, right? And we give a lot of great feedback, even just in the quoting. So what I would say is if you're looking at getting some iteration feedback, getting some design feedback, I'd assume if you're working, from it already sounds like you're working with CAD models, throw those into the protolabs.com or any of your, digital manufacturers of choice and start to get some of that feedback. The nice thing is, certain options, and Protolabs would be one of them, give a lot of great design feedback just in the quotes. So you're not paying for anything. The quote's there, and you can already get an idea of, are there challenging features, or if it's like molding where there's a lot more variables to account for. It gives you, fill pressures, it gives you shrink, it gives you all these different kind of pieces. So while we appreciate engineering as much as possible and understanding it as well as you can before you ever even approach maybe a manufacturer, one of the really nice things about that digital environment is you're never bogging us down. You're never making somebody have to stay later at work. There's so much automation in that digital presence that means that we're happy to get you quotes until you're blue in the face. So as long as you're getting useful feedback, I would say approach Protolabs early and often, or approach outfits like Protolabs early and often, because starting that quoting process, yeah, you'll get questions around, hey, what's the timeline on the project? And you'll get some of that businessy kind of stuff coming along with it. But you also just get a lot of really great technical feedback, and you can have conversations with engineers that are at those various companies too, if you ever need to, bounce some ideas off someone. So I would say, don't feel like there's a right or wrong place to start engaging with a digital manufacturer or any manufacturer at all. I would say the earlier you do, the more you might learn along the way and potentially save significant changes or maybe, big pivots that would come down the road otherwise.
Dan, another question from Evan, asking, as an engineer who primarily develops ancillary fixtures for testing or manufacturing, does Protolabs have any general guidance documents for engineers to follow to help lower costs with single or small batch orders? For example, minimum feature size, stock sheet thickness, etc.
Yeah, another great question. Short answer is yes. So we have, depending on the service you're interested in, we have a wide variety of guides. We have an amazing marketing team that provides a lot of really cool content. So depending what you might be looking for, like I heard sheet stock, for example, right? That sounds like we're getting into sheet metal, and we absolutely have documents that say, hey, here's all Protolabs standard gauges for sheet metal stock. If you're looking at the cutter sets we use for CNC, we have a guide for that. So the short answer is, yeah, absolutely. We can get you a lot of that information, and a lot of it exists today. And the other side of that is, I know you said I work on fixtures, one or two offs kind of projects. It sounds like you'd be ideal for what digital manufacturers do, and even specifically Protolabs, right? So we don't worry about minimum order quantity. We know that there are those jig and fixture work that is extremely valuable, but it is one or two offs. So it's not, from a business perspective, as appealing in most cases. But again, doesn't matter for most digital manufacturing outlets, and especially Protolabs. So what I would say is, if you want to get some extra information, I don't know who would be your main point of contact directly here at Protolabs, but feel free to use my first name dot my last name at protolabs.com. and I'd be happy to get you started with any information, and we'll get you rolling on that. It is Daniel. It's my mom's the full name she gave me, Daniel.Snetselaar. But yeah, if you want to get some extra information, feel free to use that email.
Excellent. Appreciate you sending that out, Dan, or you letting everybody know, Dan.
Yeah, of
Curious,
course.
just, Dan, as you think about some of the work that Protolabs has been doing, what do you think are some of the most interesting, some of the coolest projects that Protolabs really has seen kind of in their earliest stages?
Oh yeah, that's boy, which one to pick? I think the Monster Mike one, which you heard, we obviously reference. It's kind of near and dear for me specifically, because while I didn't work directly on it right when he came in, as we were kind of working with Mike more and more, I got a chance to be more a part of that. So personally, for me, I think that's cool, not only because of my own involvement a little bit selfishly, but just because of what he was trying to achieve, and then seeing some of the examples of like there was somebody who was on Survivor who Mike Schultz had made a prosthetic for. So just seeing that innovation meeting engineering, and then seeing that it's really having an impact like that, that is really really awesome. We've also done a lot of surgical robots. There are company names I can't necessarily say, and so it's going to be a little bit vague. But the surgical robots are really interesting just because of the technology that goes into that, right? The amount of engineering and knowledge that you need for a robot to do surgery on someone, right? Those are all really really cool. But then we're also seeing, this isn't necessarily unique to medical, but I see it being used more and more with medical. But we're seeing a lot of really cool work come out of like AI design, for example. So generative designs where it's not a human actually planning the design, and then seeing all these kind of really almost alien looking designs that come out of those practices. And then outside of that, I would say just at a broad level, med work going through metal 3D printing, I think is really, really interesting. And there's a few different projects I could point at, but I'll just say in general, it is such a different design approach. The mentality from a design perspective is so different that you really do kind of have to shift significantly how you see designing parts, building parts. So I think any of the work we get to do, and Med drives really cool designs, but any of that work we get to do in metal 3D printing is also awesome. So a few different examples there, but kind of a smattering of different cool things that have come across our desks.
Dan, another question here from Raymond, who says that they are a young innovator. They have a promising innovation, but like most entrepreneurs and startups, financial resources are limited, but motivation really is strong. And they are looking for some advice on guiding them through some affordable options for their developmental stages. And I wonder if you might be able to touch a bit on Protolabs free consultative design services and what might be available there.
Yeah, absolutely. So there's a few really kind of cool pieces within that question. Um, I think the first one that I would say is um, it's there are, in some cases, depending on what you're planning, some manufacturers, and we've seen this, and Protolabs has something similar, but there are some times where there are kind of innovation grants, or because manufacturing companies are obviously motivated by finding cool new ideas and excuse me, kind of uplifting the entrepreneurial spirit. There are some times where you might actually be able to get some manufacturing money from a grant that does actually help go towards some of that initial part production. So just something to think about, right? But another thing I would say is that being able to, whether you're talking about any digital manufacturer, really any place that you can get quotes and timelines together, I think as you're having conversations maybe with investors, or just maybe even there's a med company that maybe potentially eventually is looking at buying your product or buying rights to your product, having information like, here's what it'll cost me, here's my timeline, here's my plan, having that information. And you can get a lot of that just by freely quoting with different digital manufacturers. You can get a lot of that kind of planning information up front, which shows that you're not just coming with a half-baked idea. You're putting the plans out there, you've actually gotten quotes, and you've started that process with tangible real numbers. So I think that really could go a long way for you as well. But then, Ben, I love your point as well, because I can't speak to other digital manufacturers, but Protolabs specifically, we have a great applications engineering team. So even if the design is still a little bit in flux and you're not fully sure, you can start to send in those early designs and get feedback and have conversations entirely free with the team we have here at Protolabs, and we've got some awesome engineers that'll take good care of you. But then we also even have specifically what we call consultative design services, which is where our team will even help make design tweaks for the sake of manufacturing. Right now, obviously, we won't know everything about your product like you will. You'll be the expert on the end use in the product. But as far as making design changes and supporting that design work from a manufacturing perspective, we have a team that's ready and willing to do that and is doing that every single day as well. So a few different pieces there that kind of come into play. And, I always admire entrepreneurs because there is that, it does feel like a huge mountain to climb. But as you start to take some of those small steps, I think you get information, you get learnings, you get data and numbers that you can use yourself, and you can present those as you're talking with other people. And I think that'll help build up some steam, especially in the early stages.
Well, that's really great insight, Dan. Appreciate that. I know that's really valuable information, especially to the folks in our network as well. So, as we kind of wrap the conversation here, Dan, I just wonder, as you think about some of the technologies that are most exciting for Protolabs, what's really got you excited about the future that can really benefit, especially the medical device industry.
Oh, that's very much a dessert question, Ben. Thank you for that, because that's one that I'm happy to answer. So two things come to mind right away, and you've already heard me mention them because I just have a hard time hiding my excitement for them, to be honest with you. But the first one I'll touch on would be let's do AI design first. So the first sign would be that AI enabled designing. It's something that we worked with NASA on, and I can say that because we have a fully approved case study, and you can see a lot of really cool videos about that that we have online. But effectively, they were developing their own AI generated design software where they would basically say, we need to put bolts here and we need to put bolts here. We're going to have these strains and stresses going on the part, right? So they have all this information about what the part needs to do, but they don't tell the system anything about how to shape it. They might say you can't have anything in this area because there's going to be, electronics there. They can have these certain keep out areas, but they use this AI to design parts that are, I call them manufacturing ignorant, but they're also the most structurally sound they could be. So they end up looking like these curvy designs that you'd think could only be 3D printed. But what's really cool about, and this is kind of where the innovation piece gets me excited, is that NASA knows us well enough from a machining perspective, even though these designs don't look like they should be machined. But NASA knows us well enough that they can input certain details of our process, and they can generate these parts that again, you'd think would have to be 3D printed just because of their shapes. But then we can end up producing them very quickly and efficiently through CNC machining. So what's exciting to me there is that you're taking CNC machining, which is kind of an old school, it's traditional, tried and true, certainly, but it's straightforward and kind of an old school way to manufacture. And it's taking that kind of really old school way to manufacture and combining it with the most cutting edge kind of design front end that you possibly could. And seeing how compatible the two are is really, really interesting to me. And it's really awesome to see these wild and crazy designs come out that are still, perfectly manufacturable. So that piece, just where AI is intersecting with traditional and classic manufacturing methods, that's really, really interesting. And then the other big piece, you've heard me mention it a couple of times, but metal 3D printing, for a similar but kind of different reason. The designs you can generate with metal 3D printing can be truly mind-blowing. You could look at a solid cube and it would look like it was a solid cube of metal, but it could be designed to be honeycombed and have lattice work all on the inside. So it's this extremely lightweight part, but on the outside, it effectively looks like a solid cube of metal. So little things like that, just because the physics that 3D printing can enable when you're talking about building a part, there are some really, really cool designs that can be made that way. And what's exciting for me there is seeing the process of designing and the evolution of designing catch up with what that technology can do. Historically, people are always kind of designing in flat planes and right angles because that's natural as a human. But when you have something like metal 3D printing, where all of a sudden you kind of explode a lot of those preconceptions, the designs that we're starting to see are really awesome. But what even comes in the future as more folks are designing for that technology specifically and understand it better, I think that'll produce some really kind of wild and cool and innovative designs, probably within the next just a couple of years here.
That is really exciting. Dan, I really appreciate your insight. Love to see your passion for this topic here too. So Thank you for taking the time here today. And I want to thank everybody for attending as well. And if you're interested in kind of continuing this conversation, we are also hosting a roundtable discussion with Protolabs titled The Speed of Medical Device Innovation. That's November 6th. So Protolabs, along with partner Tim Humphrey, will share some practical ways that teams can really shorten development cycles, respond more quickly to regulatory requirements, and bring safe, effective products to the market more efficiently. So a lot of what Dan was talking about, we'll continue that conversation. And I'll make sure that everybody here receives the details if you're interested in being part of that discussion as well. So with that, Dan, one more thanks from the Medical Alley team to you and to the Protolabs team for everything today. Very much appreciate your insight and your expertise here as well. And to the Protolabs team for making this all happen here today too. So with that, Dan, one more final thanks to you. Thank you to everybody for attending, and have a wonderful rest of your day.